Rangers, forest workers, hunters, and other woods people of Reddit, what is your scary experience in the woods that you still can't explain? A few years back, when I was around the age of 14 and my brother was 9, my dad, my little brother, and I all went out deer hunting in the afternoon right before sundown. While we were walking through the woods, before we even got started, my little brother tugged on my arm and asked me if I saw that. I said that it was probably his imagination and he let go of my arm. A few minutes later, I couldn't hear him walking behind us anymore, and turned around to find him gone. I quickly told my dad and we looked for him for, at the least, half an hour. When he walked over out of nowhere towards the both of us, he was covered in mud like he'd fallen somewhere. I worriedly asked where he'd gone and he just stared at me, telling me that he couldn't remember and thought that he had never left. He acted normally afterwards just as nothing had happened. I don't know if this is really scary to anyone else, but it shook my entire family, including myself, quite a bit. Edit, to answer a few of your questions. Several of you have been asking whether or not he could tell or show me where he had been and the answer is no. As I said, although I hadn't specified, so that might have been on me, he told me that he couldn't remember a thing. Not what happened, not why he was covered in mud, not why he had walked away in the first place, nor that he had walked away at all. The only thing that he said he could recall was walking a few steps away from us, after seeing a doe from behind him, and that's it. He told me that he genuinely hadn't remembered walking away from us and acted like no time had passed. Also, one of you had asked how muddy it was. I distinctly remember that we had several flood warnings and heavy rains before then, but it wasn't like knee-high deep mud. It had been in the middle of fall and I can remember myself being irritated at the mud and leaves sticking to my boots. He wasn't drenched in mud, after we found him, but his knees and the palms of his hands were coated in it, along with having a few splotches here and there on his clothes. I had one other question on whether or not I asked him what he saw in the first place. He had initially told me after the entire event that he had saw a glimpse of a tall person standing next to a tree, which I, to be completely honest, doubt. As a kid, I also had one hell of an imagination, and was very paranoid, which I believe was passed down from my mother to the two of us. Lastly, someone had asked how I had found him? I'm not sure if that's the right way to word it. Anyways, all three of us had been walking north and later on, when I did find him, he had trotted out of the woods, avoiding trees, from the west. Before he had gotten to me, he hadn't really spoke, until I ran up to him and hugged him, asking if he was okay. I hope this answers most of the questions you had. Kinda creepy thing happened to me when I was a student forester this summer. So, the forest I was working in was about 20 kilometers from the nearest town, which contained around 1,200 people, and we usually set out for whatever task we have to do in the forest at around 7 a.m. So we are at the forest at around 7:30 a.m. and we are about 12 kilometers up the road when we turn a corner very slowly and see what I initially thought to be a weird looking bush or statue, but it was in fact a person, sitting on a carved out stump on the side of the road, just sitting there. What really threw me off was the fact that this person had a parka on and a balaclava underneath it in the middle of summer. We drove by this person real slow and he lifted a hand to wave slowly as we drove past, and it was just super creepy. Never saw them again after that, but it did make going out on excursions a little more uneasy sometimes when alone. Not my story, but my younger sister's, early 20s. She was in Colorado last year and went hiking with her friend. The plan was to hike up the mountain, stop midway and camp, then finish the hike the next morning. They started their hike and stopped for camp midway. She said it started dumping rain that night, which meant the top would most likely be snow. The next morning they continued their hike, but it started getting complicated. Her friend only wore Chaco sandals and not proper hiking boots as they didn't expect the snow. They stopped at a creek and were deciding if they wanted to turn back on account they weren't prepared properly when they heard a faint "help me." They both stood still. They heard it again. They decided to follow up the creek to the woman's voice. They got to a clearing that was covered in snow and found a woman laying in it in basic athletic clothing, leggings, light pullover jacket, and athletic shoes. My sister said her legs were swollen, discolored and had nasty cuts on them. My sister asked her how long she had been out there and the woman said only a few hours. My sister was like, "Okay, we need to get you down this mountain." The woman was like, "No, I need to go up the mountain, that's where my car is parked." My sister was like, "No, there is no driving access at the top of the mountain," which was a sign that this woman was confused. They get her down the mountain and my sister just kept saying how confused this woman was. They get to the bottom and they find this woman's car. My sister couldn't get cell service to call 911 during this BTW. Anyways, my sister tells this woman she's going to drive her to the hospital, but the woman is standing strong that she would just like to go back to her bed and breakfast. My sister takes her there while driving this woman's car. Once the woman is at the bed and breakfast, she thanks them and goes in. My sister spoke to the owners and was like, you have to call a medic, she is severely confused and not acting normal. They call a medic and transport her to a hospital. Turns out this woman is from Chicago, has low blood pressure, and it was her first time ever hiking a mountain. She was also alone. She had passed out during her hike, then it dumped snow on her. She was hypothermic and only thought she'd been out for a few hours. She was out overnight in the dark, cold and alone. I couldn't imagine the terror she must have felt. Anyways, my sister went and saw her at the hospital and the woman thanked her for saving her life. They still lightly keep in touch. I've lived in the Smokies most of my life. Anywhere I've lived in the Smokies, I've been completely surrounded by woods, naturally. One night at like 1 a.m. I was sitting on my porch drinking a beer. If you haven't lived out here, during the summertime, nature is loud. It isn't quiet. Cicadas humming, frogs belching, etc. It's like the ultimate white noise. While I was drinking my beer, I had noticed that everything in the woods had gone quiet. Which is pretty easy to notice when you live here because that doesn't happen. Suddenly, I heard the most terrifying noise I had ever heard about. I think maybe a good 30 or 40 meters away from me. It was a loud, shrieking, literally blood-curdling scream, like shrill. It sounded non-human. It wasn't a mountain lion because I've heard them before, and they're rare in the area I lived. I stood up, audibly said nope, and walked the fuck inside. That was the one and only time that ever happened. I still live in the same house, and still drink the same beer on the same porch. Not my story, but my dad's. When my dad was in his 20s, he was staying with my mom at a small cabin in the woods of Colorado. It was fairly remote. There was another cabin about a mile away and a campground maybe 3 miles down the valley. Late one afternoon, he was out fishing on a nearby river by himself. As the light started fading, he decided to call it a day and head back to the cabin for dinner. As he was walking back through the woods, he got an eerie feeling that he was being watched, but he couldn't see anyone or anything. He kept walking back, and then suddenly he heard a stick break behind him. He stopped, looking back for the source of the sound, but still didn't see anything. He nervously kept walking back, a little quicker, and then heard another stick break, whirls around and still, nothing. This happens like 3 or 4 times, but every time he stopped to listen and look, there was total silence and nothing else moving. By the time he finally made it back to the cabin, it was nearly dark. He never did find out what was following him, but whatever it was left him alone after that. His best guess was a mountain lion stalking him or something. Really unsettling though. Couple good friends of mine fight fires, and in WA state summer's business is usually booming. This year a fair-sized crew of about 10 of them are miles and miles deep into the Cascades doing dig lines. I'm talking like 60 miles away from anything, middle of nowhere. As they're hiking through they come to a clearing and there's 2 landed Black Hawk helicopters and about 7 fully armed military personnel. They all point their rifles at the fire crew and demand to know what they are doing there. My friend tells them they're doing fire digs and they're scheduled to be up there. They are told to turn around and forget that they saw anything up there. My friend says, but this is government work, we have to do this, this is our job. Military guy says, not today, you're done, get the fuck out of here now. Some serious Chronicle type shit. I've never wanted to know so badly about what the hell was going on out there. We lived on the Hopi/Navajo reservation growing up. My mom and I were feeding the horses very early in the morning before I went to school. It was still almost completely dark out when we hear this low, dim humming noise. The horses start acting really nervous, ours included. Sweating, pacing, nostrils flared, eyes showing white, the works. We feed them and walk out from the barn/shack trying to figure out what's happened. We look up after scanning the horizon for anything, squinting as best as we could, and there is a black triangle-like thing hovering right over us. It was almost completely silent. It was perfectly over us so you couldn't see it unless you looked straight up, and it felt like it was so close I could touch it. It was pretty damn large too, like a long triangle. Smooth and black. Thinking back, it was actually quite impressive and beautiful. Mom grabbed me and ran back into the shed. This was before cell phones were really a thing, so she just clutched me and told me not to make a sound. We waited for what felt like ages but was probably only 2 to 3 more minutes. The horses weren't even eating, they just paced the shed inside back and forth. Finally the horses started settling down to eat and my mom went outside. It was gone. We felt like we had the flu the rest of the day and I stayed home. We never told my dad. I think it was some sort of military aircraft, since around the reservation there are quiet, secret military setups, but who knows. I've lived on the high desert for most of my life, 6,000 above sea level if you're wondering. I was out riding my horse alone in the absolute middle of BFE in the Badlands, no trees, and hardly any brush to speak of, so sounds carry a long way and there is nowhere to hide for long, when all of a sudden his ears perk up. I feel my skin start to crawl like we're being watched. My normally mellow gelding starts to panic. I start to feel really dizzy, and my horse stumbles. I black out. I come to an hour or so later about 3 miles away from the inciting incident, still on my horse. He is frothing with sweat and shaking all over. I'm still not sure what happened. I had plenty of water and snacks. It was 65-ish degrees and breezy, so I don't believe weather or dehydration/hunger were a factor. I have never before or after had a fainting spell, and that was the most reliable, quiet horse I've ever owned. I now have a serious case of the heebie-jeebies again just thinking about it. Friend and I were hiking in the woods. He was at the camp and I went to check on things about half a mile away. Suddenly, as if someone flipped a switch, the woods became silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, no birds. Just the most eerie silence I've experienced. After a few minutes, it suddenly went back to normal forest noises. Thinking I must have had a seizure or temporary deafness or something, I hurry back to camp, only to see friend standing there with a confused/scared look on his face. I must have had a similar look because he immediately asked if I heard the silence. We tried to come up with an explanation, but absolute silence in the woods seems impossible. Even more so that it was so sudden. My friends and I were high in the woods deep in the Sierra Nevadas in the California backcountry and decided to travel a few miles off a path to reach a river and shoot at targets with our .22. The path is littered with deer bones and claw marks from bears, so we're freaking out a bit but finally make it to where we set up camp. I notice off in the distance about a half mile upstream the river there are 2 men walking towards us in the exact direction we are firing our gun. I yell at the guys for them to stop shooting and we just watch these men, wide-eyed and in their late 20s and early 30s, walking quickly alongside the river when suddenly they both decide to jump in. I should say at this point that the river is moving very quickly and could easily sweep you under and is definitely not safe for a casual swim. We watch as both the men are swept away towards us downstream. One of my friends, we'll call him Mike, decides to be brave and get close to the edge and extend a piece of wood for them to grab as they're about to pass us. Both the men latch on and Mike is the hero pulling them to shore. When everyone catches their breath, we ask the men what they were doing out here as it's super remote and they were at least 3 or 4 miles from the nearest trail and why they both jumped in the deadly river. They give us short answers like, "Oh, we were just having fun boys and just free swimming the river," while they're leering at us. Immediately the hairs on the back of my neck stand up and every fiber in my body tells me they mean us harm. We tell them we're going to head back to the trail and they say they're coming with us. Given that we're so far off from civilization and these guys are clearly high on something and a danger to themselves, we reluctantly agree to allow them to follow us. It was the most quiet hike of my life. I felt them trying to feel out if they could take us in a fight. There were 3 of us and 2 of them and we had a .22 but we're young squirrely adults. I don't know how to explain it, but the hike was us constantly positioning against each other with body language without ever directly fighting. They would get close to the gun and try to both be near it, then we would counter by getting between them and the gun as naturally as possible while hiking up a path that was littered in bear claw marks and dung. We finally make it to the car and they decide we weren't suitable targets and moved on. No idea what 2 random guys were doing risking their life in a freezing cold raging river in the Sierra Nevadas, or why they felt the need to size up if they could attack 3 random teens, but I'm glad nothing happened that day. Not anything like this myself, but a friend told me this story. So he goes with a buddy to hike a trail near our town. Northern Washington state, so lots of woods and trees. When they get to the trailhead, there is one other car there, and he remembers seeing a person in that car. The person in the car was just staring at them, with what he described as a really white unchanging face. He kept staring right at them without trying to hide it or look away. My friend got creeped out, and decided to leave. In the next week or 2 after that, a couple of hikers and a ranger turned up dead in that same area. Pretty sure they caught the guy, but I don't remember if his photo was posted. Super creepy. About 20 years ago I had just finished my degree and was bummed because I couldn't find a job. A former roommate/good friend and I went on an overnight backpack trip near Burr Oak State Park in southeast Ohio. About 2 a.m. we were awoken in our tent by the sound of dozens of horses being ridden all around us. We could hear muted conversation, harness jingling, hoofs clopping, and we could feel it shaking the ground. We laid in our tent and the sound just kept on, like a whole convoy was passing right beside us. After a few minutes we unzipped the tent and the sounds immediately ceased and nothing was there. It was freaky, we were afraid they were going to ride over us, it was so intense. I have no idea who or what it was, but we're camped on a trail that had been used by John Morgan Hunt's Confederate raiders during the Civil War. Not a logical explanation, but it was deafening. There were so many horses. I can still hear men's voices murmuring as they rode by. Next morning, not a single hoof print to be found. I was driving from Tucson to Denver in the middle of the night. Got tired, was pulling off and crawl in a sleeping bag in the desert far away from the 2-lane blacktop I was on, Highway 666 BTW. It's since been renamed because everybody was stealing the signs. Anyway, pull off the road, onto a dirt road and then a little further. Kind of hid the truck behind some vegetation and tossed down a sleeping bar and pad in the middle of pitch black huge star New Mexico night. No one around, no light, nothing at all. Visibility for miles. I'm completely fucking alone in pitch black nothing and getting wound down and my eyes are getting droopy. Then I hear it. It sounds goofy to say, but it's the same Indian music you'd hear in old black and white westerns. Native music, voices and a drum. I literally think I'm dreaming, and when it starts I'm fucking petrified because that noise just appearing out of nothing simply put ice in my veins. Relax a little and unfreeze, and try to be logical about what I'm hearing, which has no physical manifestation of its origin. So, thinking logically. Now instead of pure panic. I could be on the reservation at this point. Perhaps it's coming from behind a previously unseen hill. I get up, look around. I don't see anything at all. It kind of comes and goes in volume. Doesn't seem to be coming from a direction. I have no clue. I looked for evidence and didn't find any. Crawled back in the bag because I'd been driving for hours, and they sang all night. Logic tells me it had to be a group of people I didn't see. But I looked, and there were no ancillary noises like talking or stopping or anything. Just that Indian drum. And the hi-ya-hi-ya. What was originally terrifying became calming and I ended up sleeping fantastically. Later learned that was a terrible stretch of road for very bad things to happen. It sort of lived up to its 666 moniker for wrecks and bad shit occurring apparently. I've spent a lot of time in fairly wild places and never had an incident that I couldn't explain. Doesn't make them much less scary, though. When you figure out it's a cougar, bear, moose, or strange human, it's not like you exhale and relax. Scariest moment for me, to date, was the grizzly that was circling our camp in the dusk at about 20 meters. Packed my family into the car as fast as we could move, but it wouldn't have been fast enough if the bear had attacked. I really regret it. I feel that I failed as a parent, because it's only luck that nothing horrible happened. I don't think I'll ever forget seeing its green eyes bobbing and swaying in my headlamp. It briefly rushed our vehicle as we left, too. Scary as fuck. Edit. The closest I ever came to an inexplicable moment was when I was walking the trail less black spruce up north in the fall and suddenly hit a wall of odor the likes of which I'd never smelled before. Stopped me in my tracks. Some instinct told me that it was a bull moose, and sure enough, in about 20 more meters, there was a clearing with a massive bull. It was rutting season, so I got the hell out. Backwoods hiking, camping trip up in Maine. Trail intersected overgrown logging road. Checked topo map. Saw logging toad lead to isolated pond. Hiked to pond. Found small clearing. Perfect spot to camp. Went to bed shortly after sunset, 8:30 p.m.-ish. Woke up around 1:30 a.m. to distant but loud noises coming from all angles around us. Up the logging road both directions, across the pond and in the woods. Deep bass Y groans and hoots, occasionally hitting higher pitch noted. Been in the woods for most of my adult life. Have come in contact with just about all the larger mammals of the Northeast and have never heard those noises before. Haven't heard them again either. Will never forget that sound. I had a similar experience a few years back. I was camping at a campground that was empty. It was a getaway with a girl I was seeing at the time. I've spent most of my life hiking and camping and growing up in the woods. I woke up in the middle of the night to a whooping animal noise. It was unlike anything I've ever heard in the woods. Some have suggested it was a fox or something more realistic, but I swear to God it sounded like a monkey howling, like it belonged in a jungle. Not the woods of northern Pennsylvania. And it was far off, so it kind of had that reverberation that echoed, and you could tell that whatever it was pretty large. I was hiking through the remnants of a remote, long abandoned town in the surrounding area. To get to as far into the woods as I was, you had to cross fallen trees over a creek 3 times. I had just crossed the 3rd bridge and was about 5 miles in, and something blue caught my eye just ahead of me. There was a man, in his 60s at least, wearing blue satin pajamas, sitting in a tree. The closer I got to him the louder he laughed. It wasn't a maniacal laugh, but it set off all the alarms in my head nevertheless. He also wasn't wearing any shoes and looked well groomed/cleaned. I gave him a friendly nod as I passed and he just kept laughing. Then it stopped. I turned and he was gone. There was no branch cracking, plants rustling, nothing. He was just gone. Still rubs me the wrong way. The area I was in was a pretty rough hike, very secluded. Not very many people venture as deep as I was that day. No idea what was going on there. I live in South Spain, near some really ancient forest called Los Alcornocales, which has some kind of trees that are almost extinct and only grow here and in another 2 or so places. It's a bit of a rocky terrain, and if you ever are walking on the forest and try to climb some rocks, you should be really careful, because usually you can have caves and hollow spaces under your feet and you can fall easily. So, my father and his friends usually go hiking on Thursdays so they don't find anyone on the woods, besides maybe a shepherd or a forest worker, and on this day they decided to climb a really large and rocky hill. My uncle Frank remembered that when he was young he slept on a little cave when he went hunting and got lost, and he wanted to try to find that cave. After a few hours, they find the cave. It was covered in moss and grime, but it was surely the same cave. One of my father's friend, John, tried to get as far as possible into the cave, because he was in a really good shape and wanted to see all of it. The rest of them waited outside. Suddenly, John started screaming and calling for my father. He went inside and turned on his torch. Inside of the cave was a really weird shrine or something like that, with candles, 2 apples, bones, pieces of coal and ashes on the ground, a pair of gloves, a pot and a pan, etc. Everything looked really old and dusty, and it was clear it hadn't been touched in a long time. My father went to the shrine and it had a little bowl, and when he looked inside, there was something that looked like human teeth. When they got out, they packed up all their things and got out of there really fast. My father refuses to hike around there anymore, and they started hiking on the other side of the hill and into the woods. All of this was really strange, and I've never heard of something like this before. I don't know anything about voodoo or this kind of things, but my father said it looked like some voodoo shrine or some stuff like that. If any of you guys know something like this, I would appreciate an explanation. I was once canoeing the boundary waters between Minnesota and Canada. These aren't your normal backyard ponds. The boundary waters are thousands of enormous lakes interconnected with each other, think mini Great Lakes. We had been canoeing and camping along the lakes for about a week at this point. We didn't really have an itinerary, just planned to boat and camp, fish, and live off the land 2 weeks. We had a GPS and a sat phone to call a helicopter for pickup whenever we were done. Anyway, about a week in and we were set to canoe a few hours to the next lake. An hour or so in and we are in the center of an extremely long and narrow lake. Unfortunately, a storm started to blow in and the waves on the lake swelled to 2+ feet. Too much for our dinky canoes. We pull off to a random clearing on the shore and set up camp in rush to avoid being totally thrashed by a rainstorm. We just set up camp and hunkered down for the night. By the next morning it had cleared up. We started walking up the coast of the lake about 200 feet from our camp looking for a good fishing spot. What we actually found was another campsite. However, it was absolutely wrecked. Trash strewn everywhere, tent collapsed and torn, clothes on the ground. At first we were just disgusted, like what assholes did this? Or left their shit out to be bear food? The more we looked around though, the weirder things seemed though. For one, their garbage was still hoisted into a tree to keep it safe from bears, but the whole bag was ripped open despite being 30 feet in the air. Second, literally everything except the canoes were still at the campsite. Clothes, packs, food, rope, pans, like a serious set of hiking equipment. Enough for 2 or 3 people. Half of it was trashed and torn open, mostly the packs, tent, and clothes. The other half was totally untouched but thrown on the ground. Like somebody noped the hell out of there in nothing but their long johns, ditching hundreds of dollars of gear in the process. We waited a couple hours and eventually called it back to our helicopter crew, but they hadn't been aware of anybody else or gotten any distress calls. We eventually just left everything and moved camp. Everybody was pretty upset by it, and a day or 2 later we ended the whole trip early because it seemed like nobody wanted to be out anymore. It was the weirdest thing I'd ever seen. First thought was bear attack, but there was food left uneaten, and I've seen bear attacks on camps before, but nothing like this. Bears rip open packs and go after food, and are generally pretty easy to scare away. What still sticks with me is why all their clothes and packs were still there, with half being totally destroyed and half being untouched. I still don't get it. I've done a lot of other camping and hiking, rafting and biking, all around the country, and I've never had any other weird experiences like that. Started lurking around Reddit a couple months ago and finally have a thread I wanted to join up to comment on. I come from a big country family. We live on a farm, we raise our own food and meat animals, and we hunt and process. My dad's first cousin is even a licensed taxidermist. So we get a lot of hunting in. For a bit more backstory, on the homestead I grew up on, and still live on, it was my parents, my pop's first cousin and his wife, me and my 4 sisters, and my 4 female second cousins. So 4 adults and 9 kids. And sometimes my pop's brother comes to stay with us too, especially when hunting season is starting up. So hunting season, deer, is going on, and my pops, his brother, Uncle K, and the cousin we live with, Uncle V, are all getting ready to go hunting. Some of us kids decide to tag along, me, 12, my sister S, 15, and my cousin A, 14. We go out further into the woods than we normally do, set up camp, etc. Important fact, during the time we're setting up, my pops and uncles are being quiet, while the 3 of us kids talk. My voice hasn't changed. This is important. Us kids keep chattering away, while the adults are just letting us get our energy out while they check the survival equipment, make sure the guns are clean and working, etc. Strong silent southern types, ha ha ha. There's a rustling in the thick brush around us, and suddenly 3 creepy looking guys enter the clearing. They stop dead. One of them has a hand on his knife on his belt. They are clearly drunk as fuck. They keep looking between A and S and my pops and uncles, like they're debating something. My pops and uncles stand up. Last bit of backstory, every dude in my family is fuck off huge. I'm 19 now, and I'm 6 feet 5 inches. My dad is the biggest at 6'10", 280. Just deeply intimidating man, and so are uncles V and K. The guys laugh nervously as my uncle V picks up one of the freshly cleaned rifles and points it at them. These dudes start running out the clearing like the devil was after them. My pops immediately says we're clearing out. My uncles don't even question it, and neither do us kids. We're freaking out, and we totally take things down sloppy, but my pops doesn't say anything about us messing up his camping equipment. We get back into cell service and my dad calls the cops about seeing those fuckers, but the cops don't seem to think it's serious since nothing happened. It's at that moment I realized, A, S, and me with my unchanged voice were the only ones these guys could hear talking. They thought they'd come across a camp of 3 girls by themselves. I don't want to even think about what would have happened if my dad and uncles hadn't been there. So, this happens in 2002, in Brazil. Me and my friends went camping in a forest in the Monte Carlo, similar to the Appalachians. We were in 7 people and everyone brushed the gun, pistols, rifles and machetes, not an AR-15, in case we had to protect ourselves from bandits or something like this. We were pretending to stay 4 days in the woods. Our camping site was about 1.5 hours from the main road. We made camp in the afternoon, and when night came we liked to fire and drank and ate, locked and everything that's good. Around 1 p.m. it started raining and it extinguished our fire, so we turned our, very bad, electric lights on, when it started. First the cattle of a nearby farm started making a lot of noise, the birds woke up and started screaming like crazy. This went for around an hour, then suddenly, it all stopped, full and mortal silence, all animals stopped making noise. At this point we were terrified. With our guns loaded we made a circle, all of us were in the military and one of us was in the BOPI, a special ops police, unkillable lads. Then we heard movement near us, something was watching us from a near distance, we couldn't tell where because of the noise of the rain. To worse our situation, one of our electric lights went off. How cliché I thought. We were in darkness surrounded by something in full silence. That's when we heard the scream. I can't even describe it. It was a very high-pitched sound that lasted for a long time. About a minute, a lightning fell in the woods and for seconds I saw it. A very tall, skinny thing with humanoid traits. It just wasn't human, very long arms and black eyes. We then packed up as fast as possible and then ran to the car and left. I didn't sleep for a few nights after that incident. So and I were off-roading in the Cebolla National Forest. On a few of the turns, there's a spot in the trees looking out over a cliff. At one of these, we saw a weird thing in the air. I can't even really say it was in the sky, because it was too close. I could see the other parts of the mountain behind this thing. It did this weird thing, almost like a loading bar, lighting up white back to front, then vanished. I still don't know what that thing was. We both saw it. It had a wider back and went to a point at the front, and the front part curved down. It was terrifying the whole way out, because the road wasn't wide enough to turn around on and there were more openings in the trees like that ahead of us. No missing time, nothing weird like that, but it was a good minute before either of us said anything. I've been back since, took months before I was willing tbh, and never saw anything like it since. In 1992 he owned about 150 acres in a remote area of East Tennessee. On this land he had a large fishing pond and a stream running through it, and he used to leave lines out at night to pull in big catfish. This pond was accessible by 2 small game trails through thick patches of woods, and he would need to drive to the trail entrances from his house near the front of the property and walk about a half mile in with his gear and nothing but a headlamp for light. This was something he did pretty often, and my uncle was a lover of the outdoors, so this was business as usual for him. Vietnam vet as well. Anyway, this particular night in July 1992, he went down to the pond at about 9:30 p.m. to check his lines. As he was doing so, he heard a loud splash and assumed it was a fish jumping. He carried on with what he was doing and then heard a low, guttural groan and what he described as monkeys flighting just on the other side of the pond. It was about 70 yards across. Multiple loud splashes occurred, and he also heard a loud crash in the woods just yards away to his left. He talked about how he immediately felt a sense of panic and was attempting to get visuals using his headlamp, but whatever was producing these sounds was behind tree cover. He said that the woods then erupted in continued sounds of fighting monkeys, and he opted to drop his gear and run down the trail toward his truck. Apparently, even in his adrenaline-fueled state, he could hear footfall on his left as he was being hunted. He got to his truck and hauled ass out of there to the road and back to his home, which, mind you, sits on the property about 6 miles away. He went inside and locked every window and door, grabbed a gun, and stayed up and vigilant the entire night, but nothing more occurred. He called my dad the next day, who sort of just laughed it off. Well, for my uncle, whatever he experienced scared him so badly that he put his land up for sale and sold it a few months later. Until he died in 2017, he would maintain that he believes that he walked into a group of Sasquatch and they erupted in territorial displays to get him out of there. He never enjoyed the outdoors after that. This wasn't a man who I took for a liar. I was out hunting with my older brother and his best friend a few years back, want to say 2016. We had been walking along a trail for a good 5 km at least. On one side of this trail is a decent drop and then a river, and on the other side is a decent uphill section and a huge pine forest. It was about 1 a.m. by this point, and we were just sort of quietly talking to each other when a horrific noise split the air. We all froze and looked at each other with the expression on our faces doing all the work. What the fuck was that? We knew it came from up in the pine forest, and where we are there aren't any big predators or really anything out there that we should be scared of. So we shouldered our rifles and headed up to find out exactly what made this sound. I wish we hadn't. We got to a clearing and the trees were thinning out, and my brother flicked on his spotlight. Big bright fucker, excellent range. Way up ahead of us was the strangest looking figure I've seen. Like the general shape of a wolf, but just off. It was just stopped on the edge of another tree line further up the hill, looking right at us, pacing side to side. My brother's friend and I had our rifles trained on it, trying to get a good look. We couldn't count out the fact it was another hunter's dog that was lost, so we, against my gut feeling, went up after it. As we went up after it, it became increasingly obvious this thing was watching us very intently. The closer we got, more we realized this was definitely not a hunter's dog. It was big. Really big, and just the way it moved and its entire demeanor was just so unsettling. We kept 2 rifles on it and one the opposite direction, slowly made our way back down, and haven't been back there since. Don't really talk about it either, as we still don't know what we saw, and people usually jump to the bullshit conclusion because, like I said before, where we live there's not really any big predators. In my opinion, and I've lived in very rural areas my whole life, the majority of creepy night screams in America can be blamed on cats, cougar, bobcat, foxes and owls. The majority, but not all. If you want to read just my scary experience, skip to last paragraph. We live in a farm along a small feeder creek. In our area, row crops, corn and soybeans, are the main crops, so most land is cleared except along the creeks and rivers. This concentrates the wildlife. For 20 years foxes have made a den under our barn, and some generations are tamer and nosier than others. 2 summers ago they were so loud, making every scream and weird sound you can imagine, we couldn't sleep with the windows open. We also have large numbers of barred owls. I got to see a batch learn to fly as both parents stood by, and these birds have an amazing vocabulary. When our young grandchildren visit in the summer months, we usually put a tent in our backyard and my husband and I camp out there with them. The sounds you can hear on a night like that are truly amazing. One year we had foxes running past the tent about every 20 minutes, making their weird strangled cry. When they got back to the den, we'd hear growls, nips, barks, yelps and all manner of noise as the young ones played and fought. The barred owls do the who cooks for you all call often during the day. But at certain times of the year, groups of them start in at dusk with what I call monkey calls. It's quite chilling the first time you hear it. I can't describe it, just imagine a bunch of monkeys doing their typical monkey chatter and you have it. Screech owls, especially if near your home, and I once had one perch on my chimney, are another level and sound like the devil is screaming. All this said, I've heard a scream 25 years ago in South Missouri that had to come from such a large chest it truly frightened and confused me. My husband also heard it and to this day has no idea what it was. We were camping at Merrimack State Park. It was deep and long and induced terror in your heart. Whatever it was above the campground close to the river. We both sat straight up in our sleeping bags looking at each other and said, "WTF was that?" I was raised in those hills, never heard it before or since. For a couple of weeks every time it approached sunset when I'd finish for the day, everything would go eerily quiet, almost like clockwork. It stood out as it wasn't normal. There's usually more noise around that time of day. Along with this, every time I left the cabin to climb down there was the unnerving feeling of being watched, but for a while it was only while climbing down. After that I started getting the same feeling while on the ground, and it somehow felt much closer and more menacing. Can only liken it to knowing you're being hunted, stalked. Not overly great when it's a 100-meter walk back to the car with nothing to put between you and whatever else might have been out there. This continued on for another few weeks, but started hearing sort of chirps and calls. They stood out as everything was dead quiet. Then one day walking back across the clearing to the car there was a long, low guttural growling somewhere behind me, and I noped the fuck out as fast as I could, and afterwards started parking the car at the base of the ladder, because fuck walking on open ground with angry sounding probably bitey things lurking about. A few days later I was driving back out and spotted a movement on the upside of the road, looked again as it disappeared into the tree line, large, long and dark. It seemed to hang around until the end of the fire season as the quietness and eerie feelings were gone at the start of the next. This happened 1 or 2 years ago to me and my stepdad. We were in Colorado on an elk hunting trip and we had been hiking all day when we got to a place that we would make camp. We are there for a few hours and nothing really happens. We scout a little and don't come up with much. This was our second ever elk hunt, so we did really know what to look for. We cooked a dinner of Mountain House freeze-dried beef stew on our gas stove. After we finish up we both sit and catch our breath. You see, me and my stepdad are from Texas and at 11,000 feet our lungs aren't holding up to the thinner air. We sit there for a while and break out our bivvies, not 100% on the spelling of that, which is basically a thicker trash bag made or reflective material and is waterproof. We shove our sleeping bags in and settle in. We were both pretty tired, but we were slightly worried about bears because I have bear spray. My dad has his 9mm Glock and my dad's bow, which is attached to his bag. We have our food bag in a tree out of reach of a bear, so we have done all the things we need to make our camp bear proof. We fall asleep and I have these weird, fucked up dreams. I hear people talking about how they hope it doesn't rain, then I hear them talking about the best way to put a fire together, and finally I just hear a fire going. I wake up to the feeling of a fat raindrop hitting me in the face. I then feel where the raindrop had hit me and it was dry. I look around and there is no fire and not evidence of any people, no nothing really. This scared the shit out of me and I sit there for a few hours, waiting for it to get light. When it finally does get light, my stepdad starts to wake and I'm sitting there still shivering even though it is only in the high 40s and I'm wrapped in a jacket, a sleeping bag and many other layers. He turns to me and says, "Dude, we need to leave." I say, "Why?" And my dad says I had all sorts of fucked up dreams. He proceeds to explain to me that in the middle of the night he had heard what he thought was a bear, then what he thought was me screaming in the middle of the night, me getting dragged away, and then finally what he thought was a bear just standing over him, and he had not been able to sleep much due to the fact that he thought his son was getting eaten by a bear. I then explained to him what I thought I heard and the raindrop, and we both agreed that we should leave and that maybe that the altitude was messing with us. To this day I don't know if it was altitude because I heard those voices and I still remember that conversation vividly. My father used to be an avid hunter when he was in his 20s, before family life and all. He's hunted all around the state we live in and does not scare easily. At the time he was working on a farm that is just a couple miles away from where we live now. The farmer knew my grandparents and trusted my father. The farmer owned a ton of land, which included quite a bit of woods. He told my dad he could hunt them whenever he wanted. My father didn't waste any time in doing so. He went hunting a few weeks later, but something was off. He told us that when he went into the woods there wasn't any noise, no bugs or tree frogs. It creeped him out, but he just played it off as an off day. He didn't any deer that day and left after a couple hours. My father went back the second time a few weeks later since he finally had a day off from the farm. This time was a bit stranger. He got a 100 or so yards into the woods and it was the same as before, no noise of any sort. Except this time he said it felt as he was being stalked. He said he stayed in the woods for 15 to 20 minutes before quickly leaving. My dad never went back into those woods. He said in his entire life up until now he never felt like that again. This farmer was going to give his farm to my dad, but he refused because of how uneasy those woods made him feel. This happened back in the 70s and the woods currently have a reputation of being haunted with Bigfoot sightings and even screams at night. There's a website for my state that lists forgotten and historical places and has a section that shows legends and haunted places by county, and the woods are listed there as a supposedly haunted location. I'm a landscaper and we manage some pretty big accounts in the woods. Well, I stepped off 100 feet or so to take a leak. I started peeing and looked up and around, and off in the distance I see someone in a red hoodie just fucking staring at me from behind a tree. This lot of land is next to a road, but it's all commercial and not residential, so besides us there really shouldn't be any other people out here but us. Especially this deep out there. I cocked my head to the side to make sure that it was in fact a person in a hoodie and not something else my mind distorted into a human. Well, once I moved, they moved back behind the tree. I yelled at them, "Hey, what are you doing?" and they took off. I'm pretty sure whoever it was did not have pants on. They could have been flesh colored, but I don't believe so. And no shoes. I was shook by the all thing, so I just called my boss man and told him what's up. We all went to do a quick search together and we never saw the person again. Hiking part of the NCT north of Grand Rapids, Michigan. We hiked around 25 miles in a day, and by the time we made camp I was in a huge amount of pain. Hadn't hiked for almost a year, so going that hard was a mistake. I was starting to get sick and couldn't get warm no matter how I layered up. I barely ate and then went to sleep. I woke up in the very early morning to slow footsteps walking around camp. They were pretty heavy and lumbering, so I knew it was a bear. I didn't dare move and tried to slow my breathing as much as possible to stay quiet. After around 20 minutes it started moving away again and I passed back out. When I woke up, the shrubbery around camp was disturbed and a friend had also woken up and heard the same thing. She was somewhat new to hiking though and had no idea what it was, so she was a little spooked when I told her. We got the fuck out of there as soon as we could. As a kid, I lived by a decent-sized conservation area in southern New Hampshire. Me and my friend from the neighboring town would go there during hunting season, because you weren't allowed to hunt on it, unlike the forests he and I usually hung around. The area spanned a river, and there were a lot of little islands and sandbars that only appeared during parts of the year thanks to snowmelt. So we forded the river, and ended up on a peninsula not that far off the trail, maybe a quarter mile at most, but across water. You'd have to swim to it most of the year. So we're checking it out, climbing the embankment and what have you, and then we both spot a camp at the same time. It was set up in the middle of this peninsula, just hidden well enough that you couldn't see it if you went boating. The damn thing had bones all over. It looked like your typical homeless camp, with some garbage, a shopping cart of all things, and a tarp tent with a really grimy pile of blankets, but what stuck out was the bones. Hanging from branches on strings, strewn around a fire pit, just generally littered about. I'm pretty sure they were deer and other animal bones, but I don't know because once we both saw that, my friend wasn't listening to my dumbass self who wanted to check it out anymore and fucked right off, and I followed. Never saw a person, never saw a boat, nothing. Just the camp and the bones. It's worth noting that the enforcement of conservation there is strict enough that you can get in major trouble if they even suspect you're there to hunt or fish without permission, and they're really vigilant about it. We also later realized that you could lay on the embankment we climbed up and watch people on the more popular trails without even needing binoculars, and there was a pretty good view of the river as well. Whoever lived there could watch people and not get seen. Friend and I agree, his gut instincts were right. It's very probable the camp's owner was there, watching us from hiding. I shudder to think what would have happened if we got closer. Me and a group of friends were camping in a clearing just outside a large woods. We got there around noon and fished and hiked until sunset. Everything was normal. We made a fire and were cooking our fish and telling stories, and once it got so dark you couldn't see past the light of the fire, things got a bit scarier. We heard the very loud yelp. We thought it sounded like a wolf, so we decided to throw whatever fish we had left back into the creek to try to get the wolf to leave. We still on high alert, but we sat back down and continued our stories. A bit later we hear the yelp again, followed by a loud screeching noise. I've never heard anything like it before. After that we put more wood on the fire and went back to our tents. We hoped the light would keep whatever was in that woods away. In the morning we started to pack up and noticed some of the fish that we threw in the creek was laying next to our fire. I have no idea what did that, but we decided it was best if we didn't come back to that spot anymore. Our old house had a forest bordering our backyard. I would get up at 4:30 every morning for work. On this particular morning, my wife was already up, staring out the window at the woods. Tells me to look, there's something lighting it up. I'm still half asleep, so I just glanced out. It's lit up almost like daylight, and tell her it's the moon, and go get in the shower. Come out when I'm done, a bit more awake now, and she points out the window. It's the moon? Then where did it go? I look back out and the forest is its normal dark. I then realize how stupid my first assumption was. The forest is north of the house, the moon would never rise over it. Could have been a spotlight. But, then it'd be the brightest spotlight I've ever seen, in the middle of the woods, for no reason. It wasn't really a scary experience. When I was around 17 years old I had a dog that was part Alaskan Husky and part German Shepherd. I lived in a rural section of the Appalachian Mountains at the time and would go hiking pretty often. My dog, I'll call him Bugs because that was his name, would always go with me. As you can imagine, Bugs was a pretty good sized dog given the two breeds he was mixed from. He didn't scare too easily and was very protective. We were on one of our usual hikes. We'd go up the hill behind my parents' house to an old coal mining road. There were a couple cold water springs near the road, and once we got within 100 feet or so of them, Bugs would run ahead to get him a drink and cool off a bit. So he took off, and because of the trees and brush of the forest I couldn't see him. I knew where he'd be. I stopped at that time to get a drink from my water bottle and rest a couple seconds. Not long after I start moving again, I hear Bugs running back down the hill. I figure he's just coming to see where I'm at. Instead, he is running full force at me with a bit of a panicked look on his face. He stops, looks at me, says woof, and takes off running full force down the hill again. I think that was odd, but continue on my hike, hoping to see what may have spooked him. There wasn't much wildlife to be feared at the time. Just some squirrels, chipmunks, white-tailed deer, opossums, skunks, birds, and the usual critters. The scariest thing might be a bobcat, but those are rarely sighted. I finish my hike not seeing anything scary. I get home and Bugs is just hanging out in the yard waiting for me. He didn't go on the next couple of hikes with me, but he did eventually rejoin me on the trips. I still don't know what spooked him. It was a strange experience, but not particularly scary, for me anyway. If Bugs were still alive, he may tell a different story. In case you're curious, Bugs died at the old age of 18. He was definitely a good boy. 2 stories. First was the year I met my wife, 10 years ago. We were 17 and I was a hunting nut. Decided to go camping in the sand dunes behind my suburb, just off the beach. We live in rural West Ouse, so nothing happens. Anyway, pretty local area, lots of people around. We decided to just hang around the beach, go walking and settle down for the night. A few hours passed and we had a small campfire going, jumped into our shared sleeping bag and went to sleep. Woke up to thudding all around us and a huge grok 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 noise. Okay, it freaked us out because I was half asleep. It was an emu that basically stood on us, and honestly the big fella was as shocked as we were and he took off. So we settled to sleep and hear it. People everywhere. They walked past us, we didn't see them though. They weren't talking, we could just hear them walking. They broke into a run and started laughing. We heard them run over the dune to the seaside, and then the chanting started. People weren't taking the piss, they were chasing someone and loving it. There were a group of people running up and down the trails around us, with a group chanting. At that stage we noped the fuck out. Called my partner's parents and they came with their Rottweiler and gun to pick us up. We walked back to the parking lot that lead to the trails with our fog snarling at everything. We could hear people running out of the darkness behind us laughing at us, some of them even taunted us to come back to the dunes. Never figured out what it was about, but it wasn't the local Aboriginal people, my wife's extended family, and it wasn't the local meth heads, but it was over 50 people at around 3 a.m. The second tale. We were homeless for a while at around 20. We rescued mastiffs and I had an opportunity to train in Melbourne and represent a gym for MMA. We drove across the Nullarbor with our 3 dogs and my wife's mother. Halfway across we got tired and saw a dilapidated roadside stop. It was just some younger woman's house with a shop attached. We pulled up and talked to the female owner and an older bloke. They looked at us and asked if we were tired. I said yeah, and they asked us if we wanted to park around back. Sure, stop for a rest cause these folks seemed nice. Drove around the back to a car park equivalent of car bodies. Okay sure, that's odd already, because the nearest town is a day's drive. Anyway, one of our dogs was unwell and needed a strict diet and to poop regularly. I get her out of the car and the other dogs jump out too. The Rottweiler takes off to explore. The dogs poop and I call our big girl back. No response. That's pretty normal, she was ignorant sometimes. I go to look for her and she is sniffing a sleeping bag. Okay fine, the place is a wreck with shit everywhere. I didn't give it a second thought. Then I looked up and saw a massive tarp wrapped up around something. And it is strung up between a few trees. Completely suspended. And behind it a few sleeping bags suspended between some trees. About 10 in all including the big one. Then I noticed the absolute swarm of flies. Got the dogs back in the car and left. Saw the woman and old bloke on the way out. Waved at them and acted natural. Nothing. No smile or wave, all former charm was gone. We dodged some Ivan Milat level shit because my dog was picky about where she pooped. Never reported this because we honestly have no idea where on the Nullarbor it was. We just kept heading east on the biggest road we could. I am sure as day we were going to be killed by some hillbilly motherfuckers. A couple years ago while hunting I went out before first light and climbed into my deer stand like I've done countless times. Right at about 5 a.m. My favorite part of the day is when the light starts to break into the sky and the forest wakes up. The nocturnal creatures retreat and the day creatures stir and become active. That morning, as the light started to appear, nothing happened. And I mean nothing. No rabbits or raccoons retreating to a den, no squirrels searching for breakfast, no deer, no hogs, not even a single bird. The weather/temperature was unremarkable and the air was mostly still. There was just no movement and no sound throughout the woods that morning. Not a chirp nor a rustle. As time passed I started to get an unexplainable sense of dread. Not a "this is weird" feeling of observing something strange, but more of a death is imminent feeling that I've never experienced before. I stayed until about 8 a.m., still early for deer hunting, until I was literally trembling with fear and I stormed out of there. I went back that afternoon and I found the woods to be completely normal with all the usual sights and sounds. Weirdest and most uncomfortable experience in the woods that I've ever had. Almost like a dream, but I absolutely was not dreaming. I have not been scared in the woods since I was a boy going out the first few times with my dad. He would joke, "We're hunting. We have nothing to fear. The forest is afraid of us." Not that morning, Dad. I was scared shitless and I don't know why. I was 45 years old at the time. So this will most likely get buried, but whatever. I was up at Montezuma's Castle, Montezuma's Well, and Tuzigood in Oz for an internship with the NPS. Most of the job was trail maintenance and destroying of invasive plants. So lots of time outside pretty much in the middle of nowhere. Many a time when I'd be out of here what sounded like hoofbeats of horses but never saw any. The hoofbeats would get really close, within a few feet, and there were times I could feel the vibration. One day I was out with one of the rangers and I started hearing it. I asked him if he heard it and he said he did and that it happened a lot. I started to ask questions when he held up his hand and told me to just accept that it was happening and to not ask questions. He seemed frightened of the sound too. I've heard it at home too in Phoenix. At my apartment complex there is a nice greenbelt area, and one morning I was on the early shift for work. It's pitch black outside. I was walking to my car when I heard the hoofbeats. It sounded like a horse charging at me. I whipped around expecting a giant dog that was running across the greenbelt, but there was nothing. The hoofbeats continued until they got to where I was and just stopped. I have never found anything on the internet about it, much to my dismay. I don't know that I would really call it paranormal. But I definitely can't find an explanation. The only two things I can think of is 1, the ground moving and it causes the hoofbeat sounds. 2, gas escaping from underground. I'll probably never know. Background about where my deer stand is. To my back is woods, then field. To my front is a field that turns into a hill that I chose to kind of act as a berm in case I miss. To the left is more woods, right is more field. This area is my family's farm and has been for a long time. Before that it was not really a forest, but slight wooded. The trees were planted by settlers. Before that it was a clear area. I'm not a superstitious person, but it says can't explain and I can't. I was sitting in my stand on a Saturday morning. I will never forget this. It was raining barely, sun just above the horizon. Suddenly I felt like I was being watched. I've never felt like that with deer. I looked into the woods and there were wolves on the edge of the woods. Neat. Those dicks just stood there and watched me. You better bet I stared back. I know they take that as a challenge, but I'm in a tree, bring it. The wolves, they just stood there, staring, watching. They stood there for 3 hours. I just started ignoring them. They scared away the deer anyways. All of the sudden they leave, double time, and some big, black thing appears from the woods. Size of a black bear, skinny like a dog, head like a bat. It stood where the wolves were. I pointed my gun at it and shot into the ground, on purpose. I don't want to be the guy who killed the last of whatever species. It looked at me, I chambered a new round, it ran. I have no idea what it was, but I asked my dad and uncles and they said they saw it too. My best friend used to have a job as a research assistant on an owl census project in New Mexico. This basically involves systematically hiking through remote forests for 2 weeks at a time, and charting where owls were sighted/owl sounds were heard/pellets were found. Then you'd get 2 weeks off, then 2 weeks on, etc. The job required that 2 research assistants hike together for safety. Unfortunately, the guy she was paired with was slow and out of shape, so he generally trailed some distance behind her. 1 week into a hike, she started to develop the feeling that she was being watched. She stopped in the middle of a clearing to wait for the other guy to catch up. Thankfully, he wasn't too far behind and realized there was a mountain lion in the trees, watching her. They both put their arms up and screamed at it until it went away. She said the most terrifying part of the whole experience was knowing that it had been following her for an entire week or longer, and was just waiting for her to be far enough away from her companion to attack. Went for a drive in the woods in southeast Alaska a few decades ago. It was my best friend driving, my fiancée riding center seat, and me in the passenger seat of a single cab pickup. We stopped at a gas station to get snacks before heading out. It was late in the evening, so it was already dark out by the time we stopped to eat some of our snacks. The night was cool as it was late fall. So here we are chatting in the truck and eating our food parked off of this long winding dirt road to nowhere. My buddy starts taking about local legends and lore including the Kushtaka. I was fairly ignorant to the idea and myth and thought it was all BS. I thought it would be funny to harass him a bit about it and push the limits of testing this Kushtaka nonsense. He was dead serious when he told me to stop. But I continued. Then I heard what sounded exactly like fingernails tapping on my window next to my head. I looked over and seen nothing but assumed I was hearing things. I couldn't see anything because the cab light was on, it was pitch black out. A few moments pass and I hear it again. This time both my finance and friend heard it. My friend sorta nervously smiled and laughed. Then I realized I had to pee. So I jokingly tell them, if I get snatched up by this Kushtaka you best come after me. I open the door and pee by the front passenger tire. But the area felt very weird and uncomfortable. I mentioned that as I got back in. There we talked a bit more and I realized we had pulled off unknowingly, at the time we stopped, near a very old small cemetery that contained frog-type headstones of the Tlingit and Haida culture in an area amongst large southeast evergreen trees. I, still not being a believer and love flipping shit to my friend, then started, yeah well, if this Kushtaka BS is real, why don't they make themselves known? Come on already. No sooner had I said that than something punched or hit the front fender twice. My buddy turned ghost white and in one motion started the truck up and threw it in drive and we were fucking gone. We got off the dirt road and back onto asphalt really quickly and stopped under a street light. We got out and looked. Sure enough, you could clearly see where something had hit, up high, the front right fender when we were parked. 2 distinct marks of dirt missing. To this day, I still don't know what it was, but with every other paranormal experience I've had since that time, there's no doubt in my mind that something was trying to tell me to stop pushing it or something bad would happen. Never again did I talk shit about the Kushtaka being BS. And I'll never go into the woods of Southeast AK alone, ever. One time on a hunting trip we were in a tree stand when across the clearing we see someone standing just in the middle of the field. We grabbed a scope to see what they were doing. My buddy looked at me and said it was a kid. We were in shock that a kid would be out in the middle of the Montana woods in winter, so we climbed down and started heading towards him. Well, as soon as we got about 100 yards away the kid giggled and took off running the other way. I yelled and started sprinting towards my bud right behind me, but no matter how fast we ran we couldn't catch him. When we started getting into thick bush we lost track of him and couldn't find a trace of him. All we kept hearing was his childlike giggle. That's when my buddy just turned and said we should go, something ain't right. We got back to the tree stand and never saw him again. We stopped off in Prey and asked some people if any kids were missing cause we saw a little boy in the woods but he ran from us. They said no one was missing from there. It was the closet town to us, so who knows. I was camping with my church youth group when I was about 12 to 13, I'm 23 now. At night we would split up into 3 or 4 and tent together. First night there, I could not sleep. My tent mates were heavy asleep, but for some unexplainable reason, I had a really uneasy feeling that kept me awake. I passed most of my time just laying and looking through our mesh window in the tent. There was only one window that faced the gravel road and about 15 yards down the road was the camp's restroom. Next to the restroom was one single street light. This is all I could see through our window. Nothing but woods around the tent other than that. Early, around 1 or 2 a.m., a dull, hovering light caught my attention. At first I thought it was a headlamp because that seemed around the same height that I was seeing this light. The light slowly moved from the restroom area to directly underneath the streetlight. That's when I realized that no human was holding the light. The orb of light continued to slowly move, and I followed it with my eyes until it reached the tree line and disappeared behind the trees. I believed no one else had seen it until I told my younger brother the next morning, also happened to be on that trip. He said that he was awake all night and had seen the exact same thing. Walking through the woods in a state park. Saw a bunch of branches perfectly twisted in a vortex manner that resembled a swirling portal maybe 10 to 15 feet high. Obviously know that somebody made it, but still creepy, and you get that feeling that you don't know if your mind is tricking you because it almost looks hazy in the center of the branch portal. Kept walking a bit further, but then it got dark abnormally early and abnormally quickly. Semi-jogging back, didn't go too far deep, and somehow didn't pass the portal again, but felt pretty worried even though I knew I was on the path. Got back to the parking lot and it was suddenly daytime again as it had been since it was only mid-afternoon. Still not sure if my mind fed into all of it because I love horror, especially creepypasta and everything creepy or cryptid in nature, but also definitely knew some weird shit happened. I was maybe 16 at the time and was out deer hunting. I was a mile walk from home hunting in a valley and sitting on the top of a ridge on the one side overlooking a riverbed and the sun was going down. I should have left earlier but didn't want to scare the deer and figured I'd wait till they left or it was dark enough they wouldn't see me leave. When I did leave it was still light enough to somewhat see but too dark to look through my rifle scope, if that makes sense. I climbed over the top of the ridge and when I did I could hear something across the dried up pond at the bottom of this side. I then seen 5 animals. Don't know what they were but they weren't canines like wolves or coyotes. They were bigger than coyotes and a lot more bulky but were super agile. They were making weird sounds I'd never heard before too. I don't know if they seen or smelled but all of a sudden they all stopped moving and went silent for a few seconds before 2 of them took off running and started looping around to my left and going behind me and 1 looped to my right while the other 2 stayed where they were. I had become the hunted and I was terrified. I started shouting and making a lot of noise and I never seen them for the rest of the walk home, but it was the scariest moment I've ever had in the woods. We went back the next day to look for tracks but it had snowed enough that night to cover them. I won't forget that night. I was working out in the scrub over the summer on a bio job. One night, I woke up around midnight and noticed it was super bright out and there was ambient light coming in through my tent. Which, generally doesn't happen at night. So I unzipped my little one-man tent and sat up out of it. The entire area was glowing green in the moonlight. Just like someone had put a green tinted filter over the moon and cranked the brightness up. I went back to bed because that was creepy and I wasn't trying to get sucked into fairy or some shit. I've never seen lighting like that before. I've been out on plenty of clear nights with bright moonlight, and stuff wasn't glowing green and shining so bright I could see it through my tent as if it was pre-dawn light. I had plenty of other weird experiences, but not any that made the fucking moon brighter and changed the color of light. Not mine, but my mom's and cousin. My mom swears there is a werewolf creature around the Camp Douglas/Fort McCoy area of Wisconsin. In the late 90s, mom and boyfriend were driving on the frontage road alongside the interstate between Tomah and Sparta. It was a full moon night in the fall. I call it a frontage road but it's sometimes visible to the interstate and other times not because of trees. What they think is an exceptionally large man runs out of the trees on all fours and leaps over the chain link and barbed wire fence around some military area. This fenced-in area has a stone entrance wall with a sign stating what it's for and the army installation it belongs to. The thing has ears you like a human, more like a dog, and leaps over the chain link barbed wire fence and disappears into more woods. They don't stop, but freak out asking the others in the car if they saw whatever it was. About 5 years later, my dad's cousin, didn't know my mom, broken family reasons, is talking to me about how he and his GF were on that frontage road driving out to look at a home they wanted to buy. It was dusk in winter. They come close to this stone entrance thing, and something is on top of it. They slowed and looked at it. They said it was a werewolf sitting on its haunches on the stone wall, and it looks right at them. Its ears move back like a dog's do when it's thinking about taking off after something. His wife screams and he floors it away. They never stopped to see the house, just made it back onto the interstate. What gets me is the 2 sightings happened years apart, and at least 6 total adults saw it. Some of them I think would just love to say they saw something like this, but not all of them are this fanciful. Nevertheless, when I had to go to Fort McCoy to get my CAC and the group of us from my employer got lost on the way in this wooded area, I couldn't help but look into the woods just in case I saw it. When my best friend and I were in middle school, we would often walk our dogs on this wooded trail that was located near our houses. We would occasionally run into wildlife out there like deer or fox, but the dogs, golden retriever and German shepherd, would just bark and chase them for a second, then we would round them up and be on our way. This day when we were walking it was late in the evening and the sun was getting ready to set, and we didn't see anybody else out in the woods. We let the dogs off the leash and they were running around having a good time. The dogs were about 30 feet in front of us sniffing/playing and just being dogs, when suddenly they both stopped almost simultaneously in the middle of the path, looked up in the sky, not too many trees in this spot, started barking, and backing up cautiously with their hackers up. We tried looking to see if there was something in the sky but didn't see anything, so my friend and I looked at each other, then turned around and ran home. No idea what caused them to do this, maybe a random high frequency we couldn't hear? We did live near a military base that does a lot of testing. Was camping on a lake once with some friends and family up north, far enough north that there was zero light pollution from any sort of city or town. For enough north you could see the aurora on occasion. We would often see moving lights in the sky, They looked like stars and our friends would explain it away as satellites, but they would zip back and forth across the sky, changing directions abruptly, crossing paths, sometimes up to 5 of them in one area. But that's not what this story is about. We were sitting on the lake shore late one night gathered around the campfire when suddenly this bright orange ball of fire starts rising from the lake. We thought it might be a firework set off by someone else in the area, but it rose incredibly slowly. And it wasn't an ember from the fire. We were all standing on the shore with our backs to the fire at this point. It rose, eyed cow high in the air, stopped and hovered for a few seconds, and then it was gone. We never really talked about it with them because of their dismissal of the other strange thing. I wish I could ask them about it now, but I have since lost contact with all but one of them, who is currently an oceanographer stationed in Antarctica.